Have you ever heard that Bible story that no one wants to talk about in conversation? Well, get ready to meet the most shocking story in the Bible, which will make you look at the report of the Old Testament in a completely different way. Between chapters 19 to 21 of the Book of Judges, we have a narrative so impactful that it touches the heart and challenges our understanding of justice, morality, and humanity. But let me warn you, this story isn't for everyone. It's heavy, contains difficult scenes, and demands courage to face themes like violence, betrayal, and a devastating civil war between tribes of Israel. If you're sensitive to these issues, it might be best to leave it for later. Now, if you're ready for a deep and transformative reflection, stick with me to the end. Promise it will be worth it. And take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because it'll be bringing you more content that will help you understand these disturbing biblical stories, which are full of lessons for our lives today. Let's unravel this dark chapter together. Holy Bible and extract powerful lessons. Brace yourself, because what you're about to read will shake you to the core. This isn't just any old story. Judges 19 is, without exaggeration, one of the most shocking, cruel, and disturbing accounts in all of history. Holy Bible, and the most surprising thing, few people talk about it. While many focus on miracles and heroes, this part of Old Testament exposes the darkest side of humanity and what happens when an entire nation turns away from God. Have you ever wondered what happens when there is no leadership, no justice, no empathy? This narrative delivers that answer in brutal fashion. It's a mirror of moral decay, of dehumanization, of the loss of boundaries. Yes, it's heavy. Yes, it's uncomfortable. But that's precisely why it needs to be read. Because this episode isn't just part of biblical story, but also a living warning for our days. If you think you've seen it all in Book of Judges, prepare to be confronted by something completely out of the ordinary. The story of the Levite's concubine, of the men of Uwood, yes, tribe of Benjamin, and the civil war in Israel will leave deep marks. And maybe, just maybe, you'll finish reading this with new questions about the world, about people, and about yourself. So take a deep breath, keep an open mind, and allow yourself to dive into this narrative, because what Judges 19:21 have to reveal can transform not only your view of Bible, but also your understanding of the choices we make and the consequences they carry. Before moving forward, it is important to make a direct and necessary warning: this shocking biblical story not suitable for minors or those sensitive to traumatic themes. The content we'll cover involves extreme violence, abuse, death, and a level of cruelty that can cause genuine discomfort. And that's no exaggeration. We're talking about a passage that exposes the utter moral ruin of a people far from God. The Book of Judges, especially chapters 19 to 21, doesn't soften anything. On the contrary, it sheds light on the human abyss. Without filters, the narrative of concubine of the Levite in Uwood, the violent reaction of the tribes of Israel, and the outcome with the kidnapping of women are events that shock even a reader most familiar with the Old Testament. Therefore, proceed only if you are emotionally prepared to face a story that doesn't ease a burden. Understanding this story requires maturity and a willingness to face hard truths. Holy Bible, in its raw honesty, doesn't hide the rot that arises when people choose to live without divine guidance. And that's exactly what we see here: disorder, abuse of power, and a chain of tragedies. If it were a film, it would be rated R, not without reason. But don't think that all this is there by chance. The intensity of the story has a purpose: to shake, to alert, to confront. Story of the concubine, the behavioral elevated, and chaos in Israel are part of a clear warning about what happens when we let injustice and selfishness dictate our actions. And, although painful, this plunge into darkness has much to teach. No final due Book of Judges, we find a narrative that seems to have come straight out of a nightmare. There are no heroes, no immediate redemption, only pain, disorder, and devastating consequences. Chapters 19 through 21 form a dark block of Holy Bible, highlighting what happens when society loses its spiritual and moral direction. And worst of all of this occurs within God's own people, tribes of Israel. The backdrop is a period when there was no king in Israel, a phrase that appears repeatedly as an echo of warning. It was an era of anarchy, of decisions made according to one's own will, without any sense of common justice. It is in this context that the history of the Levite's concubine, and with it, a succession of events that reveal how low the nation had fallen. This is not just a historical narrative, it is a prophetic warning. Within the Promised Land itself, cities arise where evil flourishes. You Wood, belonging to tribe of Benjamin, becomes a scene in atrocity that triggers a true civil war in Israel. What was supposed to be a society based on a covenant with God finds itself mired in brutality, division, and pain. The Bible doesn't gloss over it, records it, so we can understand where our departure from divine principles leads us. It's interesting to see how this story contrasts with so many others in the Old Testament, where God acts directly with miracles or deliverances. Here, it seems he is silent. And in this silence, human choices scream. Each chapter of Judges 19 through 21 is like a punch in the gut, forcing us to reflect, what if this were today? What if this kind of chaos were still present even in our day? It all starts with a seemingly ordinary man elevated, a resident of the hill country of Ephraim. As was common at the time, he had a concubine, a woman who, although related to him, did not have the same status as an official wife. This woman was of Bethlehem, in Judah, and for reasons that are not explained, she becomes unfaithful and abandons him, returning to her father's house. This detail alone shows how fragile the relationship was at that time. For months pass. It's a considerable amount of time, long enough for someone to let go or move on. But the Levite, in a gesture that blends pride, persistence, and perhaps regret, decides to pursue her. He sets off for Bethlehem, and there he is surprised by a warm welcome from his father-in-law. The girl's father welcomes him enthusiastically and entertains him for several days, almost as if he wanted to regain the man's trust in his daughter. This prolonged reception lasts 5 days, a detail that may seem trivial, but which speaks volumes about the narrative's mood. We perceive an effort on the father-in-law's part to keep the Levite there, perhaps to prevent the young woman from being returned or rejected. The Levite, in turn, seems hesitant, but firm in his decision to take the woman back. This reunion could have been the beginning of a different story. But unfortunately, tragedy was already lurking. This excerpt from Book of Judges seems calm, at first glance almost routine. But make no mistake, it sets the stage for a brutal turn, like the silence before the storm. As we follow the steps of the Levite and his concubine, we sense an invisible tension building. And when they decide to return to Ephraim, the path they choose will lead them to Yo Wood. And what happens there will change the course of history and of history itself. Tribe of Benjamin forever. Upon returning home, the Levite and his concubine avoid the city of Jebus, choose and go to Yo Wood, city off tribe of Benjamin. This seemingly simple decision triggers one of the darkest episodes of the Book of Judges. Unlike what one would expect in traditional hospitality, the couple finds no welcome, and what seemed like a normal stopover turns into a nightmare. In Gibeah, the lack of hospitality is shocking. Only one elderly man, a local elder, is willing to welcome the Levite and his concubine. This gesture, which should be seen as a flash of humanity, soon gives way to a terrifying scene. Wicked men surround the house, with cruel and violent intentions. The environment that should protect becomes a death trap. In a desperate attempt to save the Levite, the elderly man offers his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to the attackers. It's a horrific choice that reveals the depths of the city's depravity. The Levite, in a position of extreme powerlessness, hands over his concubine, who is brutally raped throughout the night until she succumbs at the door of the house. A tragedy that will forever scar future generations. The concubine's death is not just an isolated crime, it is the trigger for a chain reaction. The horrified Levite decides to cut her body into 12 pieces, sending each one to the tribes of Israel as a cry for help and protest. The scene, although macabre, serves to awaken an entire nation, which cannot ignore the abyss in which it finds itself. The Levite's reaction to the brutal death of his concubine is dramatic and full of symbolism. Instead of simple lament, he takes a shocking step. He cuts the woman's body into 12 parts and sends each piece to the tribes of Israel. This gesture, besides being a form of denunciation, was an urgent call for the entire nation to become aware of the gravity of the crime committed in Yo Wood. This cruel and simultaneously symbolic act serves to arouse indignation and horror among the tribes. The Levite clearly demonstrates that this is not just a local problem, but an evil that affects the entire nation. Nation of Israel, the message is clear: moral disorder is eroding the foundations of the community, and no one can turn a blind eye to this reality any longer. The response from the other tribes is swift and unified. The brutality suffered by the Levites' concubines sparks a cry for justice that transcends the borders off tribe of Benjamin, provoking a collective feeling of outrage and sadness. From that moment on, the conflict ceases to be personal and becomes a national crisis, which will culminate in a violent civil war in Israel. Upon witnessing the tragedy his concubine endured and the local authorities' inability to punish the perpetrators, the Levite channels his grief into action, becoming the trigger for a mobilization of the tribes. His reaction, though extreme, shows how a lack of leadership and justice can lead a society to chaos, something that Book of Judges repeatedly denounces. The indignation provoked by the crime in Uhud unites the 11 tribes of Israel in an unprecedented decision to fight against their own tribe of Benjamin, who refused to hand over those responsible for the tragedy. The entire nation mobilized, and thus began one of the bloodiest civil wars ever recorded. The Book of Judges, the atmosphere is tense, and the fear of destruction hangs in the air. This confrontation is not just a physical battle, but a moral clash. On one side, the search for justice and exemplary punishment; on the other, the preservation of the tribe itself, which faces a threat of extinction. The tribes unite against the Benjamitas, however. The resistance is fierce, and the fighting drags on for days, leaving a trail of death and devastation throughout the region. The result is devastating: the almost total extinction off tribe of Benjamin, leaving only 600 fighting men. This near annihilation exposes how fragile Israel's social fabric was, and how deep the internal crisis was. The Holy Bible spares no detail, showing that internal conflict can be as destructive as a foreign invasion. This episode makes clear that the absence of leadership, symbolized by the phrase "in those days there was no king in Israel," resulted in chaos and uncontrolled violence. The Civil War shows the brutal cost of disunity, lack of justice, and refusal to follow God's ways, making this passage of the Book of Judges a true warning for all generations. After the devastating war, the 11 tribes of Israel face a serious dilemma: how to preserve their tribe of Benjamin, which was practically decimated. The answer found, although controversial, shows how much the nation's survival was still a priority. They decide to secure wives of the few remaining Benjamites, but to do so, they resort to a controversial kidnapping of women. The first measure is to attack the city of Jabesh Gilead, who had refused to help in the war against Benjamin. The women of this town were captured to serve as wives for the tribe's survivors. This action, while seemingly a practical solution, exposed the moral contradictions of the moment and highlighted how justice and respect had been undermined by the violence. As there was still a shortage of women, the tribes organized a religious festival in Sala. During the celebration, the Benjamites were authorized to kidnap the young women present to secure their future families. This decision, once again, reveals the extreme and desperate measures taken amid the chaos of the period reported in Book of Judges. The outcome shows a mixture of pragmatism, despair, and a certain relief at maintaining the continuity of the tribe of Benjamin. Still, the episode raises questions about the ethics of human actions in times of crisis, reinforcing how confusing and painful this chapter of the biblical story, what seemed like a solution, actually brought new pain and challenges. This story makes it clear that the lack of responsibility can lead an entire society to destruction. The famous phrase "in those days there was no king in Israel" is not just historical information, but a warning about the dangers of a lack of leadership and accountability. When everyone does what they think is right, without moral guidance, chaos and injustice quickly spread. Furthermore, the story exposes a devaluation of women at the time, a strong critique of codification and dehumanization. The Levite's concubine is no longer seen as a person and is treated as a disposable object. This shows how the culture off tribes of Israel had moved away from the principles of respect and dignity that bear the image of God in every human being. The spiritual alienation of the people is another fundamental point in understanding this tragedy. Book of Judges, it shows a cycle of moral decline that only worsens over time. The further the tribe strayed from God, the more they indulged in unthinkable actions, generating consequences that affected even the innocent, as in the case of the Civil War and the situation of the kidnapped women. Finally, even amidst so much chaos, it is possible to perceive God's grace at work. The preservation of the tribe of Benjamin, despite controversial solutions, points to a greater desire for restoration and continuity. This complex story invites us to reflect on the choices we make and how they impact not only ourselves but the entire community. As we reflect on this shocking story from chapters 19 to 21 of the book of Judges, we are invited to consider the consequences of our choices, especially when we lack firm leadership and a solid spiritual foundation. How often, in everyday life, do we ignore small signs that prevent major tragedies? This story is an invitation to not close our eyes to problems, but to act with responsibility and empathy. Have you ever stopped to think how moving away from the values that connect us to the divine can open the door to chaos? The story of the Levite's concubine and the civil war between the tribes of Israel reminds us that decisions, good or bad, reverberate beyond our immediate reach, affecting the entire community. Therefore, it is worthwhile to cultivate a critical awareness and a heart attentive to our daily actions. It's also essential to recognize the dignity each person carries, something this narrative unfortunately shows has been neglected. May we learn to value others, respecting their humanity, and prevent dehumanization from taking hold in our relationships and society. After all, mutual respect is a foundation of any peaceful coexistence. If this reflection touched you, how about sharing this content and continuing this conversation? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos that will bring more incredible stories and lessons from Holy Bible. Let's seek knowledge and transformation together.